All right. Hello, folks. We are excited for another session of Hanger Podcast. This is our new podcast focused on developer experience. And today with us, we have Ian Nowland, coming from formerly Datadog. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, give us a background of how you got into Datadog, and share a bit about your journey till that point.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so my name's Ian Nowland. I've been in the industry 24 years. I'm Australian. I moved to the US in 2006 to work for Amazon. Eventually found my way into EC2, where I spent a really long time. In 2016, I actually moved to New York, and I moved to a compute platform team. I had a fintech here in New York. After a couple of years of that, I decided I really wanted to get back to a vendor, so I joined Datadog right as it was going through hypergrowth. So originally, I just ran the time series database team behind the metrics product. But over the next 4 years, as people left and things kept changing, I ended up running half of engineering. So I think by the time I left a year ago, I had about 700 people reporting up to me. And we call it core engineering, but I think you'd call it most people call it a platform engineering team. So sort of APIs, data, infrastructure, including developer experience. I left that a year ago. I've been writing a book on platform engineering, and these days I'm thinking about doing a new startup.
That's amazing. And we'll come to some of your more recent experiences later. Let's dive a bit into Datadog, and we'll cover that for most of this conversation. So maybe first talk a little bit about, it's uncommon for companies to have a platform engineering, which is half of the company. So I also understand that Datadog is unique in which it is a platform itself. So share a bit about philosophy behind having platform engineering as half of the engineering org itself, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of facets to it. So I joined Datadog right as it was pivoting from one product, the metrics product, to sort of the three pillars. So they were adding APM and logs, and that was already stretching how Datadog thought about common systems. And so Datadog, data's run in a name. And so what we were seeing is that we were getting a lot of overlap, and we weren't just competing in terms of compute resources. We're competing for engineers. All three products were going through hypergrowth. So as this was happening, we also knew that we wanted to go to a complete data platform. That was always, Ollie, the CEO, always made that clear. And you see that today. Datadog has over 20 products. And so one of the things Datadog, and this very much is in Datadog's DNA, is the unified user experience around data was something that was very much preached. And so what that meant is in teams that are in other companies, maybe you keep the data system closer to the run product or whatever. In our world, we're constantly centralizing them because we really want the data to be consistent. We want the queries to be consistent. So what you ended up with, I think of that org of about 700, I think about 250 were data. And so that's the sort of the outlying one. And the other thing I should mention, we were on all three clouds, so we couldn't just go use cloud vendor stuff. We sort of had to innovate that in-house. Then we had, big investments in API, front end consistency there as well. And then finally, we had the infrastructure team, not a small infrastructure team because we were on three clouds. But again, it was, so all these things sort of added up to a really big org. I'd hope, I'm not there anymore, but I'd hope as Datadog continues to expand, that ratio should change. Like if a platform team is not creating leverage and always has to be half of engineering, you start really questioning your platform strategy. But at the time when there was so much change going on, it seemed to make sense.
That's very interesting. So Datadog also has certain products which are related to platform engineering. How does that fall into platform engineering org, or does that all of those are in separate organization?
Yeah, I was more or less, I work with a peer, but I was more or less the one who had to come up with a rationale for what does it mean to be a platform and what does it mean to be outside. The two big lines that I cut were, well, one was a line I cut and one was a line I was a blurriness I was happy with. So the big one I said is, if this is directly tied to customer revenue, like there is no engineers between what we're building and customer revenue, that should not be in platform engineering. We are not going to be a revenue focused org. And if that causes certain difficulties, then we'll sort of live with them. The other one I sort of said though, because even then, even in actually the 700 people who weren't platform engineers, there were still, systems that were shared across multiple products. The other thing I said is if it really doesn't tie heavily to infrastructure in sort of a way that's causing a lot of contention between stakeholders, it doesn't need to be platform engineering. So yeah, there was stuff take something very well known within Datadog. The agent is somewhat of a platform because it relates to all the different products. The agent was not in the platform or because it really didn't tie that much to infrastructure because of course it ran outside. So it was sort of this line in the sand. But the one coming to your question, if it had revenue, we definitely wanted that to be in a product or tied to a product manager, thinking every day, how are we satisfying external customers? Whereas my org was like, how do we satisfy internal customers?
Very cool. Did your org typically have product managers and teams?
No, so this actually came straight. I'll be completely honest. The CEO and CPO had very strong opinions, and you can debate this either way. But they didn't really. They wanted every product manager at the company to be thinking about external customers every day. They thought that was very crucial to the company's DNA as a product company, as opposed to an infrastructure company. And so that meant when I tried to, write up a doc to pitch product managers, I got a very polite, no, we're not at the point where we're willing to blow that. What I did finally get to a compromise of is I called them product owners, but not in the safe sense of product owners where it's just tripod grooming. They were actually internal product managers, but I couldn't call them product managers. But so I do believe like the founders were like, we've all seen orgs, right, where product management gets diluted, the sense of the customer gets diluted. I would have been fine calling them internal product managers, but instead I took on product owners.
So let's get into developer experience. So developer experience as a whole, which essentially is developer experience for your internal developers as opposed to customers, that was part of the platform org that was under you.
Correct. That was like, so I had an infrastructure VP and then I had a senior director of developer experience.
Okay. So maybe you can describe a little bit of like, how does Datadog define developer experience or developer productivity? Like what were sort of like some of their mandates?
I think the three main aspects that would always come up, and it sort of changed over time, but it was always, the coding experience, the build / somewhat unit test experience, and the CI/CD experience. Although over time, whether CI should be more with build and then deployment, like that sort of merged over time. But I'd say sort of code, build, deploy was generally always three separate teams, under that senior director. The deploy, of course, we were a heavy Kubernetes shop on 3 public cloud vendors. So it was all about like, how do you wrangle Kubernetes to do nice, safe deployments? The build, we were, we had all the problems that everyone has. We use lots of open source, we use lots of languages. It's like, how do you deal with that complexity? The build, the compile was tough. We were originally a bit heavy on a laptop experience, but as the test mesh, as the surface mesh got bigger, that got hard. And so even those guys. So we're constantly, I'd say, innovating in all three areas. And probably like everyone in the industry, you'd find like no off-the-shelf solution quite work for you. So you were always, especially with your legacy problems, so you're always munging open source with the problems that you had in history and sort of building much more in-house than you'd strictly like.
Right. And there's a lot of things to unpack here. I would love to also understand what's your take on KPIs? I know we've had some conversations in the past about metrics. So tell us a bit about your philosophy and thoughts around KPIs and focus primarily on the developer productivity metrics.
Yes, so I grew up as a manager at Amazon, where every single line manager is told by middle management the importance of metrics, and we need numbers. And it's funny actually. I think Jeff Bezos was on Lex Friedman recently talking about how metrics often don't align with anecdotes. And all my experience as a line manager early on was that metrics are a model. Models are simplifications. You want to be really, really careful when you use simplified models to talk about reality. And so generally, like the way that I have this saying, if you have 10 important things, you have no important things. And I often mean that with regards to metrics, which is you generally want a handful of metrics which map to your most important problems of the day. And because there you will take the cost benefits of a model. You'll take, okay, somehow, this has got all these simplifications. It's actually not right in practice, but it's close enough. And we have to align on its importance that we're going to do that. And so what this means, and this sort of comes up in the book that I'm running, because my co-author sort of has the same philosophy, that we believe in metrics like far less than most leaders. I would say I'm a good manager, even though I don't do it. But of course, those who use a lot of metrics would insist they're good managers too. So I think a lot of this is taste and management style. But in my case, like I prefer to build trust, build relationships, dive deep, as opposed to have a metric to make me understand whether something is having a problem or not. And honestly, I managed to scale that up to 700 and it didn't cause problems. I could believe maybe if you have thousands, it stops working, but it worked fine for me. I'm managing 700 people.
That's amazing. So, did you have any core metrics for developer experience?
I mean, the developer experience, this is where, like, as the SVP, I was up the chart. Did I care about a metric for developer experience? No, I didn't. Did the senior director and directors in developer experience have metrics they cared about? Yes, they did. And so I think for them, a lot of their job, right, is they have all these stakeholders with different usage patterns, and they all sort of are complaining that their problems are the most unique problems. And so as a head of developer experience, you just get this massive backlog of unhappy customers. You have to prioritize. You have to prioritize when it's massive investment versus incremental investment. And so I think metrics are very useful for that. And honestly, if this was my burning problem, I would have cared about their metrics. I think really they looked at the DORA metrics, and it was mostly like everyone, the sort of CI/CD stuff as opposed to the deployment stuff. But they did definitely look at them at their level, and it worked for them. For me, developer experience was a constant problem, but I was much more interested in what was being built on what time frame and why they were prioritizing in certain technical solutions. And so that's sort of where I dove as a leader.
Okay, so maybe we can talk a bit about prioritization, especially prioritization with lightweight metrics. So, I mean, many leaders focus on metrics because that's a way for them to understand what to prioritize and also understand what's the impact. How do you do it in the case where there aren't really like a lot of metrics that you rely on?
Well, it's a great question. So Datadog was big on quarterly OKRs. So like everyone in the industry, OKRs weren't quite OKRs. Like it wasn't quite key results. It wasn't quite objectives. But it was like we would sit in a room as a leadership team for a week, spend an hour on developer experience amongst all the other teams, and you would basically see what they're planning out. And so part of what that process is my SVP peer, the VPs under him, my own VPs, they're all allowed to say, hey, I see this project, I see your prioritization, I've got why. So it's much more relying upon, I guess, social information to sort of question the roadmap and doing that quarterly and being disciplined, putting in the time and really listening for feedback. But there is this, the constant challenge of platform, right? In the face of prior tech debt, when whoever before they were moving faster, right? Every company starts moving slower, they start getting more engineers. So you have this tech there, you always have two choices. Do I hack a feature into the existing system, or do I bet on a new technology that's going to take a long time to deliver and it's going to do it right? And I find a lot of platform teams fall in love with the, build the V2, build the golden path. And so I found a lot of my job as a leader was especially empowering my staff engineers in this, actually not doing it as myself, but questioning why. Why is Bazel really going to save the world? Why can't we just fix the old system? And so I think in encouraging those conversations and basically seeing when people were aligned or when they weren't, that was sort of my strategy as a leader to get a good sense of whether the team is doing the right thing or not. And, look, everyone's allowed to propose new ideas. This is sort of what we do as engineers. But yeah, if in the face of feedback, you want to double down and insist, your new system is absolutely needed, well, then you start questioning the effectiveness of their leadership. But if they have a good idea and then they get feedback and they compromise, then you see to me, that's a functional organization.
Very cool. So just to summarize, what you're saying is focus more on why, especially in terms of like the bigger bets, as in like why do you need to create a new platform versus improve the existing one?
Yeah, but the key thing it requires, not every leader likes to do this. Like everyone spends their time and focus in different places. Like what it required out of me as a leader was to understand what was on those roadmaps and to understand the conversations that were going on. That was usually like a bunch of, I have a long career as an engineer, but there's also a lot of conversations beforehand. So I was prioritizing, say, one-on-ones with staff engineers, one-on-ones with VPs ahead of the OKRs. So that allowed me to judge it. So I think when leaders lead more for metrics, maybe they have lots of other problems, but they really want, where our time between check-in and production is going low, so that must mean we're successful. I know there's situations where that's the right thing. I also know with situations that's just a metric. And so, yeah, but for me, I prefer my way.
Awesome. So there's also these days some thoughts process behind space metrics, or like rather space frameworks, which focus a little bit more on sort of like getting feedback also from the developers themselves. Did Datadog do surveys, kind of like developer surveys, or kind of like asking about like what are some of the key challenges, and were there sort of like any kind of quantitative or
Yes,
qualitative?
so there's two answers. So Datadog, even before I got there, like I don't know who put the practice in, but Datadog was very systematic actually on employee surveys, about all aspects of happiness in the role. I guess in the initial survey, because it was aimed at not just engineers but everyone at the company, they had a little bit of time about tools, but not a they didn't go super deep that I've seen some people do. And so honestly though, so you'd get some amount of value out of the metrics there. But I would read every single comment. Like I actually use this quote literally in the book, which is, when there's smoke coming out of someone's ears, there's often fire. So when someone cares enough to rant about something, quarterly survey, you want to really understand. Like, again, sometimes they're ranting, right? We all have bad days. Sometimes they're ranting, but sometimes they're just representing something that everyone else has just normalized and isn't going to complain about it. So I found the comments of those surveys really useful. As I was leaving, like it was really only in my last 12 months as we started hiring these product owners, the infrastructure org started doing standardized surveys, much more tool by tool by tool. That's at the fintech I worked at. That's what we did that as well. And that was very useful. It often gave you more detailed feedback. It also gave you a sense of heat between, hey, you have maybe you have 20 different platforms. They all aren't great, but you could definitely see the heat, like where people are really unhappy versus where there's someone unhappy. And that would help you a lot in terms of where you need to put more headcount to prioritize. So yeah, I'm a big believer in both those types of surveys.
That's amazing. So it sounds like you were saying the qualitative surveys or like feedback is a lot more valuable than sort of like quantitative metric driven feedback.
Qualitative, yeah, it comes down to scale. Qualitative is great, but I could tell you when Datadog had 1,500 engineers as I was leaving, it was hard to read all those comments. So I think as your engineering numbers get bigger, this is a place where metrics that can compress some of that data down does give you more actionable information. So that was, I think, 2 Sigma. I think that was the fintech I was at. I think between data scientists and engineers, it was about 1,500, and the quantitative data was valuable there. Like it clearly allowed, say, me at one point to invest heavily in the developer laptop experience over other things because it was just such a hotspot. Whereas if you just looked at the comments, you'd just see people complaining about everything.
Interesting. And would you typically do surveys anonymous or like would developers do surveys with their names?
Surveys were all, yes. The surveys at both places were anonymous. I came from Amazon. Did surveys like this back in the day. They were anonymous, and at one point, like I worked out who someone was, and they were very unhappy that I worked out who they were. And I think people feel more ability to be honest if it's anonymous. I think I generally prefer anonymous. I always like when I ask for peer feedback, manager feedback, or whatever. I always give people the option to put their voice on it or not. But I think for this type of feedback, anonymous is better.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. So let's talk about CI visibility as sort of like a new area of exploration for Datadog. This is now tying in actually building a product which is focused on inner loop of developer experience. So I'm imagine, given how you described your team is structured, that this is part of the product org and not part of the platform org. But share us a bit more about the story behind it. More specifically, would it was this like kind of like in some ways baked into the platform org and eventually built as a product, or was it like always a part of it as a product?
Yes, so there's this interesting thing at developer tools companies, being on the platform team for developer tool companies. You have a good idea, and you get told by your leadership, don't build that because that should be a product someday. So there definitely were people on the developer experience team who wanted to build it internally. But classically at Datadog, and we sometimes they've sometimes compromised. But classically when you had those ideas, it's like, look, we'd rather try and build this in a product and dog food it then build something internally that's much better because we can focus, but then always have to play catch up to that. So this was a case where, yeah, I know from the senior director of developer experience, they would have liked to have built it, but they weren't allowed to build it. We were going to require someone because Datadog, and I think any good dev tools company, like dog fooding has to be in your DNA. And so in the end, they acquired a company. I wasn't that close to the acquisition. Datadog in general, like, everyone in the industry sort of knows it at this point. They call it a shift left strategy. And it's basically the idea that, like, I always, I've been in the industry 24 years. I was writing Visual Basic in 2000. And in 2000, when, it was big applications, you could literally do like very rich debugging on your development workstation. That somehow it's become much harder today. And so when I look at like the general thread between shift left, a lot of what it's trying to do is just to be, how do you get more information sooner? And of course, CI/CD, which is, or CI, I guess, is much less than CD. CI is this point where, flaky tests is like the bane of the industry, right, in many ways. And so the easier you can make it for someone to debug whatever, and, see metrics, just fix that problem. Like the higher that you can raise quality of the software. Like, the worst outcome of this is like a flaky test detector, which just flags everything red and no one ever looks at it again. So I sort of look at what Datadog was doing. That's basically, this is just the platform guy, not the product guy. It's just trying to, how do you raise this quality of CI by taking the exact same observability stuff you have in production, but applying it more at the testing phase. So that's the rationale for it. I believe it makes sense. I think it's a fairly successful product, but actually I can say that because I actually have no idea personally how well it's doing.
That's awesome. So this also brings up another point of contention in developer experience, which is inner loop more important or is outer loop more important when it comes to improving developer experience? Do you have and Datadog in some ways supports both as a developer workflow, like as a product platform. So any thoughts on inner loop versus outer loops?
I mean, I always come back to my 11 years as an engineer when I think about questions like this, and the answer is both as important, but that inner loop, like that sense of flow, the old joke that, right, as soon as it goes above 30 seconds, it's 5 minutes and you're going to go get a coffee, and it completely kills, you have to swap out of your brain and swap in. I think if you're really looking at productivity, in my mind, it's all about the inner loop. Like the more that you can make that actually testing in production and make that every iteration. Like I used to love Ruby on Rails, where I could change a file, save, and sit in a browser in seconds, because the flow was just incredible. So I think the more you can optimize inner loop, the better. I do think there is a reality, and again, this is just the reality of service mesh in production and stuff. But look, if you need production quality traffic to actually test this thing fully out, well, then you're much more into testing in prod, outer loop. Like it's going to be a bit slower probably. So I'd say inner loop as far as you can take it, and then outer loop, to handle the cases that you can't. That again, this is probably just my biases as an engineer, but if you've written code for a long time, you very well remember that breaking the sense of flow, just how much time you were wasting getting back into it.
Right. It's context switching in the flow state.
Exactly.
Right. Sweet. Okay. So share a bit about your challenges of scale, especially kind of when it comes again to developer experience. You said your organization also scaled really quickly, 1,500 developers. That's not easy for any organization to manage. What were some of the core challenges, and especially around code bases? Were you a monorepo, polyrepo? How did you scale that? And you mentioned Bazel as well. So maybe try to cover a little bit more overall scaling engineering.
Yeah, I'll cover. So I'll answer that question. Although when you first started asking, there's this other aspect that I think, in some ways, it's definitely not as visible, but it actually dominates. So the biggest problem, Datadog was roughly growing between 40 to 50% year over year in engineering for about 6 years. When you're bringing in that many people, that many engineers, right, and they're all collaborating around a code base, the first thing about scale is actually culture, right? Like it's actually. So you're hitting two things. You often going past Dunbar's law, but suddenly you had this code base that was working great, but suddenly you have too many people and they don't know each other anymore. A lot of them are new. A lot of them actually have better ideas because they came from bigger companies, but they have no idea. Like they often are too forthright and, we just need to use Bazel's my classic punching bag, because it seems like every ex-Googler loves to think it solves the world's problems. it's not like that they're totally wrong, right? But a lot of the problems you're trying to do is, as a leader, is integrate culture. Try to make sure both voices remain heard, and especially the DNA of what made you successful stays. So Datadog was, say Amazon was very much a divide and conquer culture. So like if you came in there and trying to get people to collaborate, you were sort of fighting against culture. Datadog was the complete opposite. It was a highly collaborative culture that thrived best when you just got 5 engineers in a room from 5 different teams and let them do it. So the first thing you were often thinking about, like what looked like a problem about build tools, was actually a question about culture. And so that was always on your mind. So coming to the technical aspect, so Datadog was big on acquisitions as a growth strategy, and not just like I don't want to knock them because they're a successful company, but like Salesforce does acquisitions, then does minimal integration, right? Like it's all about login, it might be about security. Datadog really wanted it to be a cohesive product. So they'll do these acquisitions and they would, reskin the UI to have the UI be integrated. But on the back end, then you'd end up with like all these different technologies in the code base. So Datadog for a fairly small company was using like 6 different languages, 6 different clients you have to write if you have to support it. The acquisitions, you end up supporting every different storage engine, DynamoDB, MongoDB, Postgres, just because as these acquisitions come in, that's what they were using, and they want to move fast because we're a product company. We want to add value. So what a lot of our challenges looked like was, heavily multi-language code base, rapidly a high use of open source compared to, say, Facebook, Uber, Google, who in-housed a lot more of this. And we wanted to leverage open source as much as we could. 3 cloud vendors. So, a lot of the sort of defaults where it's just like we had to build our own platforms as well. So I think they were causing a lot of our challenges in all of our developer experience team. I'd say, no, the fourth one is, of course, just Kubernetes itself. Datadog adopted Kubernetes in 2018 when there were no there was no Argo, and there might have been, but Argo wasn't what it was today. And so just how do you build good deployment tools for this Kubernetes thing on multiple different regions? So that's what like really stretched the developer experience team. I guess one more thing I should add, but I think this stresses a lot of things. So I'll mention compliance and security regime was the other thing. So you go from these small customers who don't care to mid-sized companies who have better security engineers, and they start like vetting you. And then you start going for compliance where they're just, I guess there's some amount of negotiation, but there's a lot less negotiation around, what it means. And so that really was heavy weight on the developer experience team as well. Suddenly, like, how we managed our dependencies, how we kept them up to date. So I'd say all of those things technically were stresses on the team as we grew. And like what did the solution look like was very different things in each of the different places.
I mean, it's always great to hear about this experience of scaling an organization, especially that large. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. Tell us a bit about, what are you up to since you left Datadog? What are some of the new explorations, some of the new things you're looking into?
Yes, I left Datadog a year ago. I've been writing a book on platform engineering, which is, some of the stuff I've just talked about, and also the fintech I was at. It's funny that the book is on platform engineering, like it's going to be called Platform Engineering Leadership, I think. As my co-author, her name's Camille Fournier, she wrote The Manager's Path. As we've been writing it, like it clearly is much more a book about managing platform engineering teams than like, the architecture or anything. And what we have sort of come to is like, we all actually know technically how to build good platforms. A lot of what stands in their way is how do you keep your stakeholders on board when you build the right thing? And the other aspect is, right, we know we sort of have these 2 personas in software. We have the developer persona and the DevOps or SRE, various names. Platform teams really require them to collaborate. You need the developer to write a lot of code. Otherwise, you're just an infra team, you're just operating stuff. But you really need the DevOps or the SRE to really understand the depth of the complexity that's there. So a lot of successful platform teams we sort of come to is how do you balance that? So we've been working on the book, I guess, for probably about a year now. It's I've been saying it's about done for a few months. I hope it's about done. I hope it's done this month. And so that's what I've been working on. And as that's been finishing up, I guess between my background and stuff we talked about, and then writing the book, like it's really had me thinking about like the state of platforms, the state of developer experience today. And I've sort of come to the realization like Kubernetes is this super complex thing, but it's likely it's not going away as much as we all sort of hate it as much as we love it. But how do you make the Kubernetes simpler for use cases. So I sort of have looked a lot at like, why the service meshes haven't taken off as much as they could have. And so I'm kicking around with a co-founder a few ideas in the space. One of the ideas is actually like the test in production idea. Like, how do you make it much easier to like deploy a B version of a service and send shadow traffic to it and just learn? Like, it's one of those things. I saw teams at Datadog invent this all the time. And so you sort of start wondering, would a vendor build something that you could actually sell? So that's where we are. It's still, we haven't raised. We're very much ideating. I hope we start, but there's still some work ahead of us.
That's very cool. And once this podcast goes live, and your book also comes out, I will link your book also in the footnotes so that people can find that book. So let's go a little bit into rapid fire. I know we are over time, but like we can try to cover a few questions quickly. So try to keep them short. Okay. What's your take on Copilot, GitHub Copilot?
So we had, I guess, all the good end. Like, I haven't written production code in 10 years. So I've asked people about it. And like all my friends are sort of FANG engineers and like FANG like level engineers. And they all say, look, it's great for smarter templating, but I need to understand everything it does. And so I'm not sure it's a 5% improvement, not a 90% improvement. And I've just got to imagine like the nature of complexities, that's going to be true across the industry. The one thing I think I'm most optimistic about it is sort of ideating. So say you've got a UI and you actually, rather than just having mockups, having functionality behind those mockups, where it doesn't have to be production quality perfect, but I can really believe Copilot could be useful there. But otherwise, like other people have said this, right? That the work of code is not the writing it, it's the understanding it. It's that one detail that causes an incident for 12 hours and makes you spend a week debugging it. I don't think the LLMs are ever going to be well enough trained on detail to actually get that right. So it's just like moving, it does the templating, and then the human has to understand it. I don't think you've gained that much time.
Awesome. What about AI in general? There's a lot of advancements happening in the AI. Is there some area that you are more excited about, or like somewhere you're thinking AI is doing interesting aspects for developer experience?
It's somewhat tied, like developer experience. Like, I think there's, I will say I actually invested in a company doing this, but I saw some other companies. Like, there's definitely this idea that between joining code and observability and applying maybe not LLMs, but other techniques around AI, that you can make debugging much faster. I think that's like, again, like we all, like if you see what you do when you debug, you can imagine that. And so I think that's a really interesting space. In general, like when LLMs are compressing information, like I get excited when they're trying to like be magical creators of information, right? Like I get a lot more skeptic. Outside of pure creative things, like we've all seen stable diffusion type algorithms do amazing things in creativity. As it's more about actually like detailed work, I'm pretty skeptical that LLMs are the solution to where we are. And some things might come along, but like I'm old enough to know people who were in the AI winter of the 80s, and yeah, we should all be optimistic, but maybe it's another 10 years before we see the next major innovation.
Okay. And do you have any favorite tools in developer experience?
I mean, I haven't really production code for 10 years. I mean, every sort of millennial and younger sort of like, I mean, to me, VS Code, as an old guy who, sort of loved Visual Studio back in the day, VS Code is incredibly well done, and like full credit to them for building an ecosystem around plugins that, I see that convince old school Emacs people to use a visual editor. And so I'd say VS Code, I think, is my favorite one of just a massive success. Like I can't imagine what it took to pitch that, but like, because they already had Visual Studio. But yeah, I think it's been a great contribution to this industry.
Awesome. And do you have any favorite books?
I mean, the book, you probably can't see it. I mean, the favorite book I always cite is this book called Non-Zero by an author called Robert Wright. And what he talks about is like, there's this tendency for engineers in the early, especially in the early careers, and this was definitely me, to see every conversation as win-lose. And non-zero is like looking for non-zero sum games, like these compromises where it's win-win. And so that to me was very eye-opening when I read it when I was about 30. And so I always cite it as my favorite book.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Ian. This was a great conversation. Learned so much from you. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you around.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.